I spent 53 years of my life building kingdom halls without receiving a single cent. 53 years carrying bricks, mixing cement, and installing roofs under the scorching sun of 3 different continents. My hands became deformed by arthritis at 60. My spine locked up permanently at 67. And when I finally couldn't hold a shovel anymore, when my body simply gave up on obeying me, they discarded me like a rusty hammer that is no longer of any use. My name is Vernon Caldwell, and I am 71 years old. I was born in Cardiff, Wales, and was baptized at 18 in 1971. Today, I live alone in a tiny apartment in Melbourne, Australia, supported by a ridiculous government pension, no family, no friends, and absolutely nothing to show for more than half a century of unconditional service. The congregation elders stopped visiting 2 years ago. The calls ceased. My phone only rings when it's a telemarketing company. You need to understand something. I wasn't lazy. I wasn't rebellious. I was the perfect model. A regular pioneer for 32 consecutive years. A ministerial servant for 15. I participated in 27 quick-build projects around the world. I slept in mosquito-infested tents in Africa. I worked under torrential rains in the Philippines. I spent entire Christmases on construction sites in Brazil while my wife, who was also a pioneer, knocked on doors alone. They called it a privilege. They said we were building God's kingdom on earth, that our reward would come in paradise. That volunteer work was the ultimate expression of Christian love. I believed every word. I repeated those same phrases to hundreds of young brothers I recruited for construction projects over the decades. Now I realize I was just free labor for a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire that sells properties for astronomical profits while discarding workers like me without the slightest ceremony. This is my story. Before I continue, I need to ask something of those of you listening right now. If this story touches your heart in some way, if you know someone who has gone through or is going through a similar situation, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel because I plan to share more details that the organization would prefer to keep hidden forever. And above all, leave a comment saying which city you are watching from. I want to know where this message is reaching and how many people around the world are finally opening their eyes to this brutal reality. For decades, I was instructed to avoid apostates, not to read anything critical of the organization, and to consider any questioning as satanic influence. Today I understand that this control of information exists for a very clear reason. They don't want you to know how things really work behind the scenes. They don't want you to find out where the donation money goes. They don't want you to understand the system of exploitation that keeps the entire empire running. My journey began innocently, as it does for most. I was 18. I had just lost my father in a mining accident, and 2 men in suits knocked on my mother's door offering answers to life's big questions. They were kind, patient, and convincing. They showed me Bible verses that seemed to make perfect sense. They promised a united global family and a concrete hope of seeing my father again in the resurrection. 6 months later, I was baptized. A year later, an auxiliary pioneer. At 22, a regular pioneer. My whole life revolved around theocratic activities. I woke up at 5 in the morning for personal study, spent the whole day in the field ministry, attended every meeting, and participated in every program. I met my wife, Brenda, at a convention in London. She had the same dedication as I did. We married in 1975, the year the organization had strongly hinted would be Armageddon. When 1975 passed and nothing happened, many left the organization disillusioned. But I stayed. Brenda stayed. We attributed the error to our own mistaken interpretation, not the organization. This ability to rationalize contradictions would become a pattern for the next 50 years. The invitation for my first construction project arrived in 1978. A congregation elder approached me after the service meeting and said the governing body was organizing the construction of a new Kingdom Hall in Birmingham and needed qualified, dedicated brothers. I had experience as an apprentice carpenter before becoming a witness, so they considered me ideal for the job. Brenda would stay in Cardiff, maintaining our pioneer work, while I spent 6 weeks helping with the construction. I remember the excitement I felt. Finally, I would be used by Jehovah in a special way. Finally, I would have the opportunity to do something beyond knocking on doors. The elder explained it would be volunteer work, unpaid, but the local congregation would provide basic lodging and food. I would need to use my own savings to cover any additional costs. I didn't hesitate for a second. I used the money I was saving to fix our old car and bought bus tickets to Birmingham. The conditions at the construction site were primitive. 20 of us men slept in a borrowed hall, thin mattresses spread across the floor. We woke up at 6, had a frugal breakfast prepared by the local sisters, and worked until 6 in the evening with only an hour break for lunch. The tools were old and inadequate. Safety equipment was practically non-existent. I saw brothers get hurt repeatedly because we didn't have proper protection, but no one complained. To complain would be to show a lack of appreciation for the privilege of serving. The project supervisor was an American elder named Curtis Hoffman, who had participated in dozens of builds around the world. He was harsh, impatient, and treated any mistake as spiritual laziness. When a 20-year-old brother named Ian deeply cut his hand with a faulty circular saw, Curtis rebuked him for not paying enough attention before allowing him to go to the hospital. Ian returned the next day with 17 stitches and continued working normally. During those 6 weeks, I worked harder physically than at any other period of my life. I carried heavy beams, dug foundations, and climbed up and down ladders hundreds of times a day. I lost 7 kilograms. My hands were covered in calluses and cuts. At night, I could barely move from the pain, but spiritually, I felt fulfilled. I genuinely believed that every brick I laid was one more brick on the road to paradise. On the last day of the project, when the hall was finished, there was a dedication ceremony. Hundreds of brothers attended. The speeches praised the volunteer spirit, Christian unity, and the self-sacrificing love shown by the workers. No one mentioned that the building was easily worth £200,000 and had been built at near-zero labor cost. No one mentioned that the organization now owned another valuable asset without having paid a single worker. I returned to Cardiff exhausted but happy. Brenda received me with pride. The brothers in the congregation treated me with new respect. I had proven my dedication. 3 months later, I received another invitation for a project in Manchester, then Leeds, then Glasgow. With each project, my reputation as a reliable worker grew. With each project, I sank deeper into a pattern that would consume the rest of my life. By 1982, at 29, I had already participated in 12 construction projects. My marriage began to suffer because I spent more time away than at home. Brenda and I barely had an intimate life. Our conversations revolved exclusively around theocratic matters. We decided we wouldn't have children because the end was near and we needed to dedicate all our time and energy to the ministry. That decision, which seemed so noble and spiritual at the time, would become my greatest regret decades later. What I didn't realize then was that I was being systematically conditioned. Each project reinforced the idea that my value as a Christian was directly linked to my usefulness to the organization. Every praise from the elders, every positive comment at meetings, every small additional privilege functioned as a psychological reward that kept me in the cycle. I had become addicted to the organization's approval. The techniques were subtle but effective. There were never direct orders, only invitations presented as special privileges. There was never explicit demand, only the constant implication that true Christians did more, gave more, and sacrificed more. Peer pressure was immense. Brothers who worked secularly full-time were seen as spiritually weak. Pioneers who didn't volunteer for construction projects were questioned about their priorities. I became one of the most efficient recruiters in the system. I gave emotional experiences at meetings about how Jehovah always provided during projects. I encouraged young people to leave their jobs temporarily to participate. I convinced dozens of brothers to join construction crews over the years. Today, the weight of that guilt is almost unbearable. In 1985, I received the invitation that would completely change the trajectory of my life. The organization was expanding aggressively in Africa and needed experienced builders, willing to spend long periods abroad. A representative from the branch office in London approached me and said my name had been recommended to supervise projects in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. It would be an assignment of at least 2 years, possibly more. Brenda could accompany me if she wished. The proposal was presented as an extraordinary honor. Only the most dedicated and spiritually qualified received such international assignments. There would be special training at the Britain branch before departure. Our travel costs would be covered by the organization, and we would receive basic lodging and a small monthly allowance for personal expenses. The representative emphasized that it was not a salary, but just enough for minimum needs. Brenda and I talked for hours that night. It would mean completely abandoning our life in Cardiff, leaving our small rented house, giving up the part-time jobs we did to support ourselves while pioneering, leaving for a completely unknown continent without any safety net. But the prospect of serving where the need was greater, of helping to establish the kingdom in unreached territories, was too irresistible. We accepted the assignment. 3 months later, we were in Nairobi, Kenya, supervising the construction of 5 kingdom halls simultaneously in different parts of the country. The conditions were brutal. The heat was suffocating, easily exceeding 40 degrees Celsius during the day. Infrastructure was precarious. Construction materials had to be transported over long distances on terrible roads. Basic equipment we took for granted in England simply didn't exist. The local labor force was composed mainly of poor African brothers who saw volunteering on construction projects as an opportunity to demonstrate their spirituality and perhaps gain greater respect in the congregation. Many came from distant villages, leaving their families for weeks. They worked under the scorching sun with inadequate food and practically no protective equipment. I saw them faint regularly from dehydration and exhaustion. What shocked me most was the disparity between the working conditions and the final value of the properties. We were building edifices in prime locations in Nairobi that were worth fortunes, but using workers who barely had enough to eat. The organization spent as little as possible on materials, always choosing the cheapest options, even when it compromised quality and safety. But the finished buildings were presented as a demonstration of Jehovah's blessing and the organization's growth. During my 2 years in Kenya, I supervised the construction of 18 kingdom halls. Each one cost a fraction of what it would have if there had been paid labor. Each one became the property of the organization, increasing its real estate portfolio. I did the math once, conservatively estimating that those 18 buildings alone represented at least $3 million in market value. The actual cost to the organization, excluding materials, was practically zero. Brenda worked as hard as I did. She organized the kitchen crews that fed the workers, coordinated lodging, and helped with cleaning tasks on the site. She lost 15 kilograms during that period. She developed malaria twice. On one occasion, she almost died from lack of proper medical treatment because the nearest hospital was 4 hours away, and we had no reliable transport. When we finally managed to get her there, she was delirious with a fever of 41 degrees. After Kenya, we were transferred to Tanzania, then Uganda, then back to Kenya. Each country brought new challenges, new difficulties, a new level of sacrifice. In Uganda, we worked during a period of severe political instability. We heard gunshots at night. Military checkpoints were common, but the organization insisted we continue because the kingdom work could not stop for mundane circumstances. I spent a total of 9 years in Africa. 9 years of my life dedicated entirely to building properties for the organization. When we finally returned to England in 1994, I was 41 years old and had absolutely nothing in terms of financial security. We didn't own a home. We had no savings. We didn't even have furniture because we had donated everything before leaving. The monthly allowance we received barely covered soap and toothpaste. But I still believed. I still trusted that Jehovah would take care of us. I still saw our sacrifice as an investment in the coming paradise. The brutal reality of the system of exploitation had not yet penetrated my completely programmed consciousness. Returning to England, we expected perhaps some special recognition for our 9 years of service in Africa, perhaps a comfortable assignment at the Britain branch. perhaps some assistance from the organization to reestablish ourselves. What we received was a handshake from a circuit overseer and a suggestion to find secular work quickly because we would need to support ourselves. The transition was devastating. We had been away so long that we had lost all our professional connections. I was 41 trying to compete in the job market with much younger people with more up-to-date resumes. My experience as a carpenter was outdated. Techniques had changed. Standards were different. I spent 4 months unemployed, living on the charity of brothers in the congregation. Eventually, I got a job in a furniture factory earning minimum wage. Brenda worked as a cleaner. We rented a tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood in London. Our living conditions were worse than before we left for Africa 9 years earlier. Financially, those 9 years of selfless service had left us in a worse situation than if we had stayed and worked normally. The organization called it a vow of poverty, but in practice, it was simply systematic exploitation. But we continued as pioneers. We continued attending all the meetings. We continued giving everything we could in donations, even though we could barely pay rent. The mental programming was so deep that we didn't even question the disparity between our sacrifice and the organization's complete indifference to our situation. It was in 1997 that I started noticing disturbing patterns. The organization announced the sale of valuable properties in Brooklyn, New York, for hundreds of millions of dollars. Simultaneously, they published articles encouraging members to leave inheritances to the organization, to include the society in their wills, and to donate jewelry and other valuable assets. The contrast between the growing wealth of the organization and the poverty of many dedicated members began to bother me. I started paying more attention to how funds were managed. I noticed that donations for specific construction projects disappeared into a general fund without clear accountability. I noticed that Kingdom Halls were sold for substantial profits, but the money never returned to the congregations that had contributed to build them. I noticed that Bethel workers who dedicated decades of their lives received only basic lodging, food, and a small monthly allowance, while the organization accumulated billions in assets. In 1999, I was invited to another international construction project, this time in the Philippines. I was already 46. My body was starting to show signs of wear from decades of heavy labor, but I accepted because it was what good Christians did. Brenda stayed in England, working to maintain our small income. I spent 18 months in the Philippines, supervising construction in Manila and surrounding areas. Conditions were similar to Africa. Brutal heat, limited resources, poor local workers giving their time for free. But this time, I paid attention to the financial details. I saw how the organization negotiated hard to get materials at the lowest possible price, sometimes buying goods of questionable quality to save money. I saw how they pushed for impossible schedules that forced workers into 12, 14-hour days. I saw how they discarded workers who got hurt or sick without any kind of compensation or assistance. There was a specific incident that marked a turning point in my consciousness. A young Filipino man named Danilo was working on the roof of a Kingdom Hall when a rotten board gave way under his feet. He fell 6 meters and broke both his legs and his pelvis. The organization paid for basic medical treatment in the public hospital, but as soon as he was discharged, they simply sent him back to his province. No disability compensation, no ongoing support, no accountability for the safety failure that caused the accident. Danilo was 23 years old. Before the accident, he was a regular pioneer full of zeal. After the accident, he was permanently lame, unable to do heavy physical work, and essentially abandoned by the organization he had served so devotedly. I visited him once in the hospital before returning to England. He still expressed gratitude for the privilege of serving. He still blamed himself for the lack of attention that caused the fall. The level of psychological conditioning was terrifying. Back in England in 2001, I began to ask discreet questions. I asked the elders about the organization's financial management. I asked about liability for accidents on construction sites. I asked about what happened to the money from property sales. The answers were always vague, evasive, accompanied by reminders that we should not question Jehovah's arrangements or show a lack of trust in the organization. Brenda noticed my change in attitude. We had tense discussions where she accused me of developing a critical spirit, of allowing Satan to plant doubts in my mind. I backed down, apologized, and reaffirmed my loyalty. But the seeds of questioning had been planted and continued to grow silently. Between 2001 and 2015, I participated in 32 more construction projects in various countries: Brazil, Portugal, Spain, Poland, South Africa, India. In every project, the pattern was identical: intense volunteer work, precarious conditions, ignored safety risks, disposable workers, and valuable properties acquired at virtually zero cost. The machine worked with relentless efficiency. During this period, the organization further refined its recruitment tactics for construction projects. They developed a quick build system coordinated by the Regional Building Committee, where entire congregations were mobilized to build complete kingdom halls in 2 or 3 days. It was presented as a miraculous demonstration of Jehovah's blessing, but in reality, it was perfectly coordinated mass exploitation. Hundreds of people worked simultaneously without payment, from children carrying bricks to the elderly preparing meals. I participated in 17 of these quick-build projects. I saw entire families sacrifice weekends. I saw people take days off work, losing wages they could barely afford to lose. I saw elderly people working to the point of exhaustion out of a sense of spiritual obligation. The social pressure to participate was immense. Not showing up meant being seen as spiritually weak, selfish, and lacking love for the kingdom. What revolted me more and more was the hypocrisy at the top. I visited the Britain branch several times and saw how the prominent members of the branch committee lived in relative comfort: private comfortable rooms, quality food, travel privileges. Meanwhile, elderly people who had given decades of service lived in poverty, surviving on miserable pensions, with no assistance from the organization. I encountered dozens of cases during this period. A special pioneer couple who served 40 years in the Brazilian Amazon was dismissed when they became too sick to continue, with no provision for their old age. A traveling overseer who supervised construction in Africa for 25 years developed cancer and was told he should return to his home country for treatment because the organization would not cover prolonged medical costs. A sister who worked in the Bethel kitchen for 30 years was dismissed at 65 and had to live with relatives because she had absolutely nothing. In 2008, at 55, my body began to fail seriously. Arthritis in my hands made it difficult to hold tools. My spine was chronically inflamed. I developed knee problems that would eventually require surgery, but I kept working because it was all I knew how to do, all that gave me any sense of purpose and value. Brenda was having her own struggles. She developed severe depression, something common among Jehovah's Witnesses, but rarely discussed openly. The constant promise that the end was near, combined with the reality that we were aging in poverty, created unbearable cognitive dissonance. She started taking antidepressants, but felt tremendous guilt for needing medication because organization articles suggested that true Christians didn't need psychiatric help if they had enough faith. During a project in Brazil in 2010, I had an experience that accelerated my final awakening. I met a former elder who had been a Bethelite for decades and had left the organization a few years earlier. He was visiting relatives in Sao Paulo and heard about the construction project happening. He sought me out specifically because he knew I was one of the most experienced construction supervisors. We talked for hours in a discreet cafe far from the construction site. He told me about the inner workings of the organization, about branch committee meetings, about how decisions were made, and about the society's true financial situation. He described a cold corporate system where everything revolved around growth, expansion, and asset accumulation. He said members in leadership positions lived in relative comfort while promoting sacrifice to the rank-and-file members. Initially, I resisted the information. I called him an apostate, accused him of bitterness for being expelled. He corrected me calmly, saying he wasn't expelled, but left out of conscience when he realized he could no longer be part of the system of exploitation. He offered me documents, evidence, and financial records. I refused to look, saying it would be like accepting apostate literature. But his words stayed in my mind. For months after that conversation, I began to pay attention differently. I began to connect dots that had always been visible, but that my conditioning didn't allow me to see. I started calculating how many hours of volunteer work I had given over 4 decades, how many properties I helped build, and what monetary value that represented. The numbers were shocking. Estimating conservatively, I calculated that I worked for free for at least 55,000 hours over 40 years on construction projects. If those hours were paid even at minimum wage, they would represent hundreds of thousands of pounds. The value of the properties I helped build easily exceeded 50 million pounds, and I had received exactly 0. The year 2016 marked the beginning of my discard. I was 63, and my body simply couldn't take the heavy physical work anymore. During a project in Poland, my back locked up completely while I was carrying beams. I was literally paralyzed with pain, unable to move. I was taken to the hospital where they discovered I had 3 herniated discs and severe spinal degeneration resulting from decades of intense physical labor. The Polish doctor was direct. He said I needed to stop all construction work immediately or risk becoming permanently disabled. He recommended surgery and at least 6 months of recovery. When the project supervisor found out, his reaction was cold and calculated. He thanked me for my years of service and said they would arrange my flight back to England as soon as I was able to travel. There was no offer of medical assistance. There was no compensation for the disability caused by decades of service. There was no recognition that my body was destroyed by working for free to enrich the organization. Just a return ticket and a suggestion that I seek treatment through the British public health system. I returned to England physically and emotionally shattered. Brenda had to help me dress because I couldn't move without excruciating pain. We went through terrible financial difficulties because I couldn't work and our only income was her minimum wage salary as a cleaner. We applied for government disability benefits, a humiliating process that took months. During my recovery, I finally allowed myself to read critical information about the organization. I discovered online communities of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. I read hundreds of stories, almost identical to mine. Bethel workers dismissed in old age without provision. Special pioneers abandoned when they got sick. Families destroyed by the disfellowshipping policy. Child sexual abuse systematically covered up. The documented evidence regarding the organization's wealth made me nauseous. The Watchtower Society had billions in real estate assets. They sold properties in Brooklyn for over $1 billion. They had substantial stock market investments through various subsidiary corporations. Meanwhile, dedicated members like me lived in extreme poverty. What revolted me most was discovering the organization's legal tactics to avoid responsibility. They structured corporations in complex ways to protect assets. They used volunteer labor systems specifically to avoid labor laws. They instructed elders not to document certain matters to avoid legal discovery. It was a sophisticated corporate system hidden under religious rhetoric. Brenda did not follow my awakening. The more I questioned, the more she clung to the doctrines. Our relationship deteriorated rapidly. She saw me as an apostate, influenced by Satan, spiritually lost. I saw her as a victim of brainwashing, unable to see the truth even when presented with irrefutable evidence. In 2018, after 43 years of marriage, we separated. The separation was devastating but also liberating. Without Brenda's constant pressure, I could explore my doubts fully. I connected with support groups for ex-witnesses. For the first time in decades, I had honest conversations about doubts, fears, and regrets. I discovered I was not alone, that thousands had gone through similar experiences. In 2019, at 66, I officially disassociated myself. The response was immediate and brutal. All my contacts in the organization cut off communication instantly. Friends of decades avoided me on the street. Brenda stopped talking to me completely. I was treated as dead by a community I had served for 48 years. The loneliness was almost unbearable. I spent months in deep depression. I considered suicide several times. Everything I knew, everyone I trusted, my entire sense of identity and purpose had been built around the organization. Without it, I was a 66-year-old man with no family, no friends, no financial resources, no relevant professional skills, and a destroyed body. But slowly, I began to rebuild. I connected with other ex-members who became my new family. I sought therapy to process decades of psychological manipulation. I started working part-time in a small carpentry shop where the owner was understanding of my physical limitations. I learned to live with very little and find value in simple things outside the religious structure. What I could never do was recover the lost decades. 55,000 hours of free labor that I will never be compensated for. The opportunity to have children that I sacrificed for the organization. My relationship with Brenda destroyed by toxic doctrines. Physical health ruined by exploitative labor. These are permanent and irreversible damages. In 2021, I moved to Melbourne, Australia, seeking to start over in a place where no one knew me as a Jehovah's Witness. I wanted to escape the pitying looks, the occasional reactivation attempts, and the constant reminders of what I lost. Australia offered a better climate for my damaged spine and an active community of ex-witnesses who welcomed me. Here at 71, I live modestly on my government pension in a one-bedroom apartment. I have few material possessions. My furniture is second-hand. My clothes fit in one suitcase. But I have something I never had in 50 years inside the organization. Genuine freedom of thought, peace of conscience, and relationships based on real affection instead of religious obligation. Today, at 71, I look back and see my life with brutal clarity that mental programming previously obscured. I was part of a massive system of slave labor disguised as religious service. The Watchtower Society built a multi-billion-dollar empire on the backs of millions of volunteer workers like me. Sincere people who believed they were serving God, but in reality were enriching a religious corporation. The scheme is brilliant in its simplicity. Convince people that unpaid work for the organization is service to God. Create a social hierarchy based on how much you sacrifice. Offer psychological rewards through privileges and recognition. Keep members too busy to question. Control information rigidly to prevent exposure to criticism. Discard workers when they are no longer useful. Repeat the cycle with a new generation of converts. I share my story not out of bitterness, though I certainly feel that emotion sometimes. I share it as a warning to others who are still trapped in the system, especially young people who are being recruited to dedicate their lives the same way I dedicated mine. You are not serving God when you work for free building commercial properties. You are being exploited by an organization that will have no qualms about discarding you when your usefulness ends. Your decades of sacrifice will mean nothing when you are old, sick, and without resources. The organization will move on without looking back, exactly as it did with me and countless others. If there's anything I have learned, it is that true spirituality cannot be measured in hours of volunteer work or properties built. It does not require the sacrifice of your health, family, and financial future. It does not demand blind loyalty to imperfect men who claim to speak for God. I have more peace now, living alone in a tiny apartment on a government pension, than I had in 50 years inside the organization, because I am finally free to think, to question, and to live according to my own conscience instead of corporate guidelines disguised as divine commandments. And that freedom, however late it arrived, is worth more than any promised paradise that will never come.